Hello! Today I'm taking a short break from Final Fantasy and delving back into the world of Tekken with a look at quite possibly the strangest character to enter the fray, Yoshimitsu. Now it's been a fair while since I've discussed Tekken, and where I've previously discussed some of the characters such as Paul Phoenix and Kazuya Mishima, which I can link to below, it seems as good a time as any to turn back and look at some of the characters in the series. Firstly, in light of the Tekken Bloodline series being announced for Netflix, which looks really cool. And of course the recent anniversary of Tekken 3, which has kind of got me playing the games again. And I think Yoshimitsu is worth discussing as a legacy character and a debutante of the first Tekken game way back in 1994. And he's been a recurring character in at least every numerical mainline game ever since. Now, I would say that Yoshimitsu's significance is twofold regarding Tekken, particularly looking at the series historically speaking. Because firstly, he was introduced as the only character, alongside his former ally Kunimitsu, to wield a weapon in the first game. So this immediately distinguished him from the wider roster. And like many kids trying to find a potential advantage, I did opt to play as him early on, thinking that the sword would be some kind of benefit. But actually the use of that and the movesets were really quite limited in 1994, so it didn't bear out quite that way. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, his perpetual shape-shifting appearances over the years, from a medieval knight to a samurai to a cyborg ninja and now a squid man, and his apparent physical degradation and alienification over each subsequent game has made him one of the most aesthetically distinguished enigmas of the Tekken series, and indeed wider fighting games. And as Tekken becomes increasingly unhinged from reality and unhinged from its earlier narrative severity, and arguably narrative sincerity, particularly around the stories operating outside of the main Mishima Bloodline feud, Yoshimitsu is perhaps an avatar of this change, and his increasingly bizarre appearances are reflective of the slide into the humorous and the absurd that the Tekken series seems to be heading in. Indeed, the official Namco description for Yoshimitsu is mechanized space ninja, which are three words that don't traditionally sit well together, but they somehow perfectly summarize the look and feel of this character, and his visual progression as the series wears on. And every time a new Tekken game is announced, the first thing I find myself doing is trying to find the latest design for him, because it's always interesting to see. And just to digress slightly, if you'll forgive my nostalgia, I have a very distinct memory of the first time I ever saw Tekken 3, which was in an arcade, and perhaps the most popular rendition to date, and something that sticks into my mind, is the reimagining of Yoshimitsu there, where he had the glowing green blade and the alien-style armour. So that's a poignant gaming memory for me, and it was a great time for this fighting game, the debut of Tekken 3. So, moving forward, let's really contextualise this character in terms of the Tekken series. And one thing I've always really liked is that, as I mentioned back in my Kazuya episode, where Kazuya subverts and flips on its head the notion of hero and antagonist, Yoshimitsu, for his part, does the same thing, because he looks quite menacing and evil, to the extent that he even wears an Oni mask, a demon mask in Tekken 1. But our first impressions here are also subverted, because rather than being a freaky-looking bad guy, he's actually one of the very few fundamentally good-natured characters that we see in Tekken. So the production team, I think, did a really good job kind of defying conventions when it came to designing many of these characters. And the aesthetic and the narrative stereotypes in the series are often turned on their head, particularly when we look at characters like Yoshimitsu, like Kazuya Mishima. Now, Tekken 1 sees Yoshimitsu as the leader of the Manji clan, who are a band of outlaws that rob from the rich and give to the poor in a very Robin Hood fashion. And the premise of Yoshimitsu's first narrative arc is that his clan are intent on stealing the tournament winnings of the first Tekken tournament. And Yoshimitsu participates here as a form of distraction. Along the way, in the canonical story, he encounters Ganryu, who appears as his sub-boss, and being unable to steal the tournament winnings, his clan settles for stealing Ganryu's riches, because of course he's a famous sumo wrestler, and this prompts the ending animation of the Manji clan pouring money onto the streets of a deprived village, with a little cameo from martial law there. Progressing into Tekken 2, Infighting within the Manji clan is alluded to when Kunimitsu switches from becoming Michelle's sub-boss to Yoshimitsu's sub-boss due to the canonical storyline of Kunimitsu attempting to steal from the Manji clan for personal gain. And I'll take a moment here just to touch on Kunimitsu, because I think she's one of the original Tekken characters that I'm most gutted to have sidelined and subsequently unmasked in the canonical games, because she always had a very enigmatic and mysterious appeal, in many ways more so than Yoshimitsu, because she existed on the fringes of the clan, on the fringes of the game story, as this unlockable sub-boss, which is an element of game design that of course doesn't exist in Tekken anymore, but it made her very enigmatic and interesting, and her character's design was also very strong, with the cat-like kabuki mask that some would argue has been compromised in recent years and demystified by the design decisions that have taken place there. But back to summarising Yoshimitsu's narrative arc, it seemed like around Tekken 2 that Kunimitsu was being positioned as his long-term nemesis, and by the close of Tekken 2 we have this vendetta being established. But as we now know, Tekken 3 made a huge narrative step change for the series by switching out much of the roster who were taken out by the ogre character, and they introduced a whole set of new characters, most notably Jin Kazama, who replaced Kazuya as the central figure. But for Yoshimitsu's part, Kunimitsu was replaced by Brian Fury as his central foil. And to this end, Yoshimitsu's game story kind of devolved into a series of vendettas with Brian, as the latter kind of comes after him and injures Dr. Boskanovich, who is Yoshimitsu's ally, and so on. And I'd like to stress I'm not criticising the direction that Tekken 3 took here, because I understand the decision to keep the series fresh and introduce a new set of characters, a new generation of characters. And I do maintain that it's one of the best games in the series. However, there was a clear impact for a lot of secondary characters after Tekken 3 with regards to their story, the sincerity of them, and how seriously they could be taken. I think Yoshimitsu is arguably one of those, and while it felt like the Yoshimitsu-Kunimitsu angle could have gained some momentum, they decided to kill it off because, of course, Kunimitsu was absent in that title. So, fast-forwarding to Tekken 7, we can see that concluding the Mishima Bloodline feud was prioritised in that game, and I think rightly so, because it had been meandering on, and Tekken 7, with its dedicated story mode, I think did a good job in sort of drawing a line under that. But again, looking at what remains of the traditional arcade mode, which is where we fight through to a sub-boss and unlock an ending for each of our characters, Yoshimitsu's arc here his ending consists of performing CPR on Leo and then getting kicked in the nuts. So I think it just underlines the point about storylines being devolved here for much of the secondary roster. Now, before moving on, I think it's worth touching on an interesting subplot that kind of meanders beneath the surface of Yoshimitsu's arc, and that's the sword that I mentioned earlier, because it's not just a weapon, it's not just an advantageous instrument to use during battle, but from the very outset of the series, the sword is narratively significant to Yoshimitsu, and it's a hereditary and powerful asset that's been handed down generations, and specifically belongs to the leader of the Manji clan. And the significance of the sword is much more thoroughly explored in the Soul Calibur series, which is slightly beyond the remit of this discussion. But suffice to say, the former Yoshimitsu from the Soul Calibur games back in the 16th century would pass down this sword, which is also called Yoshimitsu, to subsequent leaders of the Manji clan. So in the contemporary events of the Tekken series, we have our current Yoshimitsu, and particularly in the events of Tekken 6, he's pursuing powers with which the cursed sword can consume. And this goes some way to explaining why Yoshimitsu is so consistently sacrificing his appendages and body parts due to the horrifying amount of power that the sword now contains and is now consuming. And the duality of the naming convention between Yoshimitsu the man and Yoshimitsu the sword is significant because of the sacrifice that the man makes for oneness with the weapon, and the ability to wield this instrument of death. So actually, I think this is a really interesting bit of subtext that isn't thoroughly explored in Tekken itself, but really contributes to our idea of the character, and explains why he is the way he is, and perhaps why he looks the way he looks. And the introduction of Yoshimitsu's second sword, Fumaken, is also narratively significant, because it was acquired and adopted by the character, specifically to try and contain and counteract the negative consequences of the primary cursed sword. So many have posed the question in the past of what is Yoshimitsu, but in my opinion this is the wrong way of looking at things. The point and purpose of Yoshimitsu is, after all, the sword. The man is merely the vehicle to fulfill some martyrdom as a benevolent guardian of the sword and a leader of the Manji clan. His entire purpose is to make the world a better place as an anonymous, kind of like a masked superhero that we might see in Marvel and DC. However, where the Marvel and DC heroes often have their real-life alter egos, Yoshimitsu is assimilated entirely into the role of guardian, and upon taking up the position of the leader of the Manji clan, he sacrifices his identity, his uniqueness, and his humanity for the greater good. And indeed, Yoshimitsu isn't even a name, it's a title. So what we've witnessed across 7 numerical games is an infinitely unknowable and unfathomable being, which, despite theories to the contrary, this is very much what Yoshimitsu is, and what makes him so cool, in my opinion. And I think this lack of explanation and lack of identity is a good thing, because it gives the Tekken team a huge amount of license to alter his characteristics into increasingly bizarre and malleable iterations across Tekken's timeline. And whether it's the traditional feudal knight style class we see in the first 2 games, to the alien armour in Tekken 3, the blue skeleton in Tekken 5, to the strange squid man that we see today, the license with visuals, and indeed his moveset, is part of Yoshimitsu's appeal. And despite the quite disparate representations up until Tekken 7, he's always loosely followed something of a samurai-esque sort of vibe, and maintained some marginal consistency throughout the games, if only with his moveset and the sword. Now, finally, just wrapping up on Yoshimitsu's fighting style, this is classified as Manji Ninjitsu, and is probably the style that takes the most artistic license through the history of the Tekken series. And it derives from multiple styles, such as Kenjutsu, but it's prudent to note that Kenjutsu and Kendo as well emphasize two-handed combat, and Yoshimitsu is clearly a one-handed swordsman that keeps a hand free for diverse punching attacks and all of the weird stuff he does. And on this note, it is interesting to note that Yoshimitsu holds his sword in his left hand, which indicates perhaps that he's one of the only southpaw fighters in the series, aside from obviously the stance switching that we see with Horroring. But it's also prudent to note that he fights in an orthodox stance. He leads with the left. So I can only assume that perhaps it's easier to build character models that are uniform as orthodox, rather than kind of creating an anomaly who's left-handed. So that about wraps up my considerations for the character of Yoshimitsu. His physics-defying handling that sees him rotate, pivot, jump and teleport at will continues to make him one of the most interesting characters to observe and play as in the franchise. And I'm quite confident that he will persist as a mainstay in the Tekken roster for both visual and functional appeal, at least in the short to mid-term future, because I think efforts to introduce other oddities and strange characters, such as the monstrous Gygas, they don't, in my opinion, they don't really equate to the level of appeal and legacy that Yoshimitsu has managed to build up over the years. And I'm quite confident that until an equally enigmatic and interesting character can take his place, Namco are going to be pretty reluctant to retire Yoshimitsu, this prevailing absurdity from the Tekken games. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you don't mind me digressing into discussing the Tekken series, because it is a game series that I've always quite loved. But feel free to drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts on Yoshimitsu.